Welcome to the Authority File, the podcast that features conversations about the life cycle of scholarly communication. I'm Bill Mickey, your host and the editorial director at Choice. In this series, which is brought to you with generous support from Taylor and Francis, we're going to be talking about open access, but from the publisher's point of view. In order to meet the requirements of open access distribution of scholarly content, publishers have spawned a variety of new content models. Talk about a pivot. Joining me on the next 4 episodes is Jamie Hutchins, Director of Open Research Americas at Taylor and Francis. Jamie will be sharing the progress of the publisher's new open access book publishing pilot called Pledge to Open. It's a collective model, meaning libraries from a variety of institutions fund the program, and when the fund meets its threshold, titles are made available open access to everyone. Jamie will be discussing that along with the program's unique combination of humanities, social sciences, and STEM titles focusing on global issues inspired by the UN's Sustainable Development Goals initiative, and how the publisher helps academic libraries navigate the transition to open access. In this first episode, we meet Jamie and get an inside look at the discussions a publisher has with libraries about funding open access agreements. Okay, Jamie, welcome to the program.
Hi, Bill. Good to hear you again, actually.
Yes. So let's start as we typically do on this program, and that's with a description of your role at Taylor and Francis. What are the primary functions of you and your team?
Well, yes, you don't get a lot of that from my title. So I'm Director of Open Research for the Americas. It's a relatively small team. There's just 4 of us, but our role essentially is to provide a specialist service that overlays with our other services in the US and across the Americas. Our focus is really to work with the library community primarily, although we do connect with other institutions and other like government agencies, really to bring a focus to partly open access is a big part of what we do every day, but also to focus more on the big picture of what the transition to open research might be across the Americas. And then we provide a number of services, so sort of consulting with library customers. We work with what would normally be a sort of sales team, working with them on the transition towards transformational agreements. We also put in place different kinds of membership, other business models that we're starting to develop as well around different types of product. So we work across all kinds of outputs. And we also work on the other side of an agreement. So we provide customer support, and we do a heavy workload in terms of actually working directly with customers to make sure that they're set up on our systems properly, they're getting the reporting that they need, that they understand how to solve problems, and to ensure ultimately that they get the impact they're looking for from putting one of these agreements in place.
So can you describe, I hadn't thought about the sort of the back end of that relationship. Can you describe that, like the support that you provide, like what typically is involved there?
Yeah, so the negotiation is one part. So that's normally the first contact point. But really, before we even get there, we want to try and do is put in place a relationship where we understand each other's perspectives. Mm-hmm. So we see this more as a partnership and less of a sale.
Yeah.
So a really important part for us is trying to understand what it is one of our potential partners is aiming to achieve in the next time period, and then putting together the right kind of agreement for them to achieve that. Mm-hmm. In some cases, that can be starting with some education. Not everybody starts with the same level of understanding of the opportunities, the workflows that are available, the limitations on some of those workflows, or how to work with their own communities as well. So it's not that the librarians that we work with don't work directly with researchers. It's quite often that the researchers don't realize how many resources are there to support them at the library. Right. So sometimes we're actually promoting our library customers to their intended audience as well.
Oh, wow. Okay. That's a huge help, because we hear that a lot from, libraries in terms of taking the time and effort to market their resources to the library community, and that doesn't always work out to their satisfaction.
It's an interesting word as well, I think, for academia generally, the word marketing tends to not have
Yeah.
the right resonance. And
Yep.
so
Yep.
we sometimes talk about outreach.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe there are terms like that are more familiar in an academic setting and actually
Right.
lead to a less commercial sort of focus. But yeah, ultimately, our job is to really ensure that when somebody enters into one of these agreements, they're successful in
Mm-hmm.
putting it in place.
Right.
And then quite often what that involves on the back end is being able to report different kinds of metrics or measures of success to different stakeholder groups in the institution they work within. So there can be different sort of aspects of what institutions are looking to achieve through one of these
Mm-hmm.
agreements.
Right. Exactly. So you mentioned open access, and that's really what we're here to talk about. And um, but in order to get there, I was hoping we could just set the stage a little bit and talk about APCs, author processing, article processing charges, and book processing charges, and the challenges with those, and what those challenges represent with researchers and publishers, and how this continues to shift the open access market. What are you seeing there?
Yeah, it's an interesting dynamic. So I've been working in roughly in this kind of area now for 20 years.
Hmm.
So it's the APCs are not new, book publishing charges are not new,
Yep.
but they obviously have sort of different aspects to them. I think in some cases what they've done is get us very focused on the customer and treating an author as if they are a customer, which wasn't necessarily always the case in all publishing houses. When a subscription model was in place, the customer was the person who paid the bill. It was the
Hmm.
library. So a lot of focus was really around building systems for librarians. With the advent of open access and APCs, what you've seen a lot of publishers doing is really focus on the systems that provide services to authors, being much more focused on ensuring that you actually are providing value to the author and also to the librarian. So there's a connection between the two. And in many cases, at least, the basis for that has been the APC or book publishing charge, depending on which of those outputs we're talking about. So there are challenges. Obviously, the main challenge really is it switches who potentially pays the bill,
Hmm.
and sometimes we hear it called an author-facing charge. That's not entirely correct, I think, for the complexity of the systems that we have in place now. So there are authors who do pay their own bills. That is certainly the case in some subject areas, especially like the humanities and social sciences, where
Yep.
we're hearing a lot of stories about authors having to cobble together APCs from multiple sources. And that's more to do with really where the funding comes from, or if there's
Right.
even funding available. Where my team tends to focus, at least, is working in much larger transformational agreements where we're converting a proportion of what used to be a subscription charge into a fund that's available for an author community at that institution. And that really means that it's the institution who's paying those charges, and they're usually doing those in a large agreement that covers as much of their faculty as possible.
Hmm.
We've done less really with the book publishing charge. They are available. Books themselves are a different dynamic, so it's not broken down into smaller units like an article, and therefore
Right.
you could be talking about something that could have many hundreds of pages and many hundreds of hours of editorial work put into them and copy editing work put into them before they're ready for publication. And typically with an academic monograph, especially, probably heading towards a specialist community. So actually
Hmm.
a very low group of consumers.
Right.
So relatively sort of high charge, I think, is one of the main issues that we've seen with BPC and why they're perhaps less popular than the APC has been as a model.
Right. So it's not like a BPC can just fit into these transformational agreements. Like it's not like there's just this pool of money that's available to do either a journal article or a book kind of.
Sometimes, yeah, and we are seeing agreements now that are multifaceted and have multiple
Oh,
types of
okay.
output in them.
Yeah.
They just tend to say they cause issues in terms of some things that were unintended. I think with open access as it was being created, really the idea was to allow everybody to publish what they could.
Hmm.
And what we've really seen is that depending on your geography, you may or may not have access to funding. So that's either from the research funding side or from your institution. If you're in a particular subject area, you may have more or less access to funding as well. So increasingly, I think one of the concerns is really around equity and the availability of funding and opportunities to be able to publish. Although I will say we have seen massive growth in the output over the last 20 years that I've been working in publishing. So clearly, I think it is meeting a need. Whether it was designed to meet all needs, I think is a bigger concern.
Yeah. So then, kind of related to that, I mean, describe how the Americas are different from Europe, say, in terms of OA mandates and progress. I mean, what do you see happening from your perspective?
Yeah, well, you can hear from my accent as well that I started life in the UK. So I'm relatively newcomer to the US. I've been here less than 10 years. But I think one of the main things that we really find here is the lack of sort of centralized movement or mandate to affect a change towards open access. If I think about the US especially, which is our primary focus at the moment, quite often you're talking not only about 50 plus different states having different rules, but also each of the different disciplines moving at a different rate. Every school has its own funding mechanism as well. So we have the mix of private and public schools. We have them coming from different backgrounds, different ways of funding themselves. So there's lots of different dynamics happening in the US. Also focused on their subject focus. So are they research intensive or are they more of a teaching school? And that will give you a very different way of really forming or having traditionally formed their budgets. But increasingly what we always see is like everywhere, the increasing focus on the library budget itself, and whether that's the only location where we should be thinking about where publishing is funded from. Whereas just to contrast that with Europe, we obviously are typically dealing with national level deals, and where we're actually talking to a consortium that is mandated to negotiate on behalf of a large portion of the academic system within each of those countries. So there's a slight difference there. And even the way that we define a consortium in the Americas quite often is different than the way it would be in the UK or Europe. So quite often quite local, quite sort of focused on a type of school. Like, for instance, talking about the sort of research intensity of a school, there are consortia that represent high research output schools. There are others that have a much broader remit where they have schools from across all those remits.
So the fact that the Americas are just so diverse and fractured, I guess, in terms of the types and characteristics of institutions, and how does that affect the way you go to market? I mean, OA from an ideological standpoint, OA is everybody,
Yes.
but for a commercial publisher, it must be incredibly hard to sort of decide, like, if you can, or I don't even know if you need to decide, or you are sort of required to blanket the entire, academic market in the US, for example, or do you pick certain types of institutions to focus on?
Well, not every publisher is doing this the same way. So there's as many flavors of approach as there are publishers out there. We've chosen at TNF not to blanket the market with a single approach. So we're taking a very tailored approach, and we're doing that for a reason, and that's primarily because of our subject focus. So roughly around 60% of the content that we deal with tends to be in the humanities and social sciences. And so we haven't seen a very distinct plan for how open access will roll out across the humanities and social sciences for the longer term at this point. So we're seeing rapid change, but we aren't seeing it as rapidly as we would in the sciences, technology and medicine, for instance. So the way we work really is we can work with any organization, consortia or institution of any size, but then we obviously design the right kind of agreement to achieve the goals of that institution. And they're often quite different. So it does require quite a solid engagement and a lot of really like partnership building. So this can vary from an institution that just wants to take, the first dip its toe into the OA waters for the first time,
Yeah.
understand what it means for them, to others who want to convert their entire spend towards open access and really envisage a very open future for their researchers.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. So how would you characterize your discussions about OA with academic libraries? I mean, their ideas around open access are often different than the rest of the institution. How do your discussions evolve as you talk about OA opportunities with them?
Yeah, it can vary. So quite often it's the point of engagement that sort of dictates the type of discussion that you have. And quite often discussions will take a step forward and then put on pause for a while, then come back and we take another direction. Typically, the agreements that we put in place are taking somewhere between 9 and 12 months to actually get inked, although we've done them much quicker than that. But really, it starts with the intent of the institution that we're working with. So where do they start from? Have they engaged with another publisher, for instance? That can really change the course of a discussion as well. So they have maybe a model in mind that they've seen elsewhere. And then we need to take them through a process of understanding how that would fit with the publications that we have. We have to look at things like how have we worked with that institution in the past? So what kind of agreements have we already had in place? What's our starting point? And quite often it's really how do we get from that point A to the imagined point C where they want to be.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's taken them beyond a typical agreement is around 3 years. That differs from different territories, different budget constraints that they have, as well as to whether they can commit for that long or if they want to commit for longer. And quite often the rate limit is really at the institution itself and how many of these they could actually consider in any year. So quite often there's like this idea of which publisher is most important to us right now, and that they can possibly engage with 2 or 3 publishers at any one time. So they can't blanket the market. The other thing really is really the publishing history as well. So we have to go outside of the traditional relationship between the library and the publisher, which is typically about acquiring content, to really looking at publishing patterns, to understanding where their faculty have chosen to publish in the past, to see if there's any new trends that are happening and if there's any likely trends that we need to consider going forward. So that we don't want to sort of overbuild these complexity of these agreements as well. We want to make them simple. And increasingly what we're talking about is building workflows that are friction-free for authors. So they understand what's available to them. They understand that the library wants them to use the funds available. And they actually want to maximize the impact that they get from that investment.
Mm-hmm. Okay, excellent. I mean, it just seems like there's so many variables,
Yes.
And I understand like you want these agreements to be as simple as possible. But I mean, I guess you're coming to the table, I guess, with a framework, kind of pre-baked, and then kind of accommodate the variables as you best you can from there, I guess.
I mean, that's exactly the case. What we talk about having a global framework. So we work with institutions and organizations of different sizes across the globe. So we have a framework that has similar patterns within it, but we pick the right aspect of that framework for each agreement.
Okay.
So again, a national level deal is used to inform a local level deal with an institution, but obviously the scale is very different.
Yeah. Okay.
But again, one of the key things in here, the reason for having frameworks is that we have some core working practices, which is part of the way that we try to ensure equity, so that we're not offering something in one region just for the sake of an agreement that we then can't offer to another. And then we want to make sure that we're obviously offering something that's appropriate for each territory we work in.
You just heard from Jamie Hutchins, Director of Open Research Americas at Taylor & Francis. This episode was brought to you with generous support from Taylor & Francis. Join us next week when we talk about Pledge to Open, a new open access pilot program from Taylor & Francis that is based on a collective funding model. As always, underwriting opportunities for the Authority File podcast are directed by Choice's advertising director, Pam Marino, and all of our episodes are produced and edited by Choice's digital media producer, Sabrina Kofer, with support from digital media assistant Ashley Roy. That's all for this week. Thanks for joining us.